Thank you to both Dr. Drew Cottle and Dr. Tim Anderson for their very informative presentations. We're going to begin questions and answers time, so I'll call both of them to receive questions from the audience. It's also worth highlighting that Amnesty International were actually invited to speak at this conference, however they refused to. So we allowed them to have a platform, however they were not interested. So just a show of hands for those wanting to ask questions.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to also add to Tim's comment on refugees. I was recently watching Lauren Southern, if anyone knows her, with Rebel Media. She went and interviewed people at the Calais jungle in France, and she established that they didn't even have that many Syrian refugees there. Most of the refugees were from Iraq, from Morocco, from Iran, and from Pakistan. But the mainstream media was saying how there's all these Syrians fleeing Assad, and there weren't even that many Syrians there.
Where was this one? Where?
Calais jungle? I don't know if I'm saying it right, the one in France. But yeah, like you can see it, it's an interview, she walks around and asks people, where are you from? But anyway, my question's a bit more general. You guys said that mainstream media is defaming you guys. So how come? Could you just tell us all why they're defaming you?
Just let me start with the first part. I was in Europe a couple of times last year, and I went to Lesbos and refugee camps there. And there were some Syrians there, we spoke to some Syrians, but there are people from lots of other countries. But if you look aggregate at the refugees in Europe, in the big spike in 2015, they were indeed mostly from Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. What do those countries have in common? Western interventions to destroy those countries. The Syrians, there were very few Syrians left in Lesbos by the time I was there. We spoke to some families. Calais is another step further, going north more or less. A lot of them, there are a lot of Syrian refugees in Germany, but they do seem to be a lot of young men amongst those Syrians. Apparently the ones that came here are largely Christian. I'm not quite sure how that worked out, you know, but the transparency of our immigration department is not really there, is it? The media thing was a little bit coincidental because this conference was planned 3 months ago. And what happened to attract all this media attention in the last couple of weeks, the Trump administration, using a chemical weapons pretext, attacked Syria. And because the direct attacks were not very common, the war's been going on for 6 years, but the direct attacks in the US weren't very common. The defense of that action, I think, led them to attack us, basically. So that's why they put all those images in the media in the last week or so. Basically, the only thing that had changed, because people not like myself and Jay had been writing about this for at least 5 years, the only thing that changed was the Trump attack and the pretext for the Trump attack.
What did they say about you?
I said yesterday. I'm sorry, I haven't got it here. Anyway, they just ran some headlines, you know, attacking us. A lot of people saw it, but you know.
Hi, I've got a question for both Otheries, for both speakers, the same question. I guess Dr. Cottle first. US imperialism, which I accept both theses come forward, but the question the strongest in my mind is why? And I've got the same question for Tim Anderson. Amnesty International, I've had some personal experience and I agree with your thesis. But why? Why is the US imperialist, and why does Amnesty International give false information? Why?
Well, I'm not going to speak about Amnesty International. I will speak about, if you want, US imperialism. Oh, okay.
You don't have to.
Is this better?
Yes.
Why? As I tried to outline in the short talk, I suggested that at the end of the Cold War, the United States, or US imperialism, in a sense, had won the Cold War, effectively. And the point then I tried to suggest was that US imperialism would be on the march to achieve global domination. And I think, how has this been done? Effectively, through a series of wars, starting from, if you want, so-called UN intervention to rescue Kuwait, and then we could look at, if you want, the wars in the Balkans and various other wars. Why? Because it requires, if you want, global domination. That's my point.
Then that demands a second question. Why does the US demand global domination? Why?
Why is a madman mad?
Why is a madman mad?
So this is a good question about the nature of imperialism. Why do states or peoples try to dominate others? Not all of them do. Not all states try to dominate others. We have an imperial history in this country because we have been part of the British Empire. My father was part of the Second Australian Imperial Force. There was a first Australian Imperial Force, there was a second Australian Imperial Force, and they were precisely to defend the British Empire, basically, in whatever venture they were involved in, rather than to... But, you know, your question goes to the root of what imperialism is and why certain people dominate others. The Roman Empire didn't initially begin as a domineering force. They were attacked by others. They developed strong defensive measures. They turned into a project which ended up invading other parts of the world, basically. So US imperialism, you know, there are different theories of it. There's an economic theory that says they need new markets, they need new fields for investment and so on. But it's been going on longer than modern capitalism, hasn't it? The empires of the world. The British Empire drew on the Romans, the US drew on the British, so it's a deeper question that deserves wider sort of reflection. On amnesty, I would say that amnesty, for one reason or another, from the letter writing for political prisoners, for prisoners of conscience, why do they end up defending these wars? I think in some respects, you know, people have their own ambitions living within a certain system. They get conditioned. Like Jay said yesterday, even the left gets conditioned within this culture to adopt a lot of the assumptions of this culture that we can go and save people in another country. The aid industry, people want to go and save people in poor countries. And they have this idea that somehow, you know, they're going to go and take the place of the agency of other people rather than respect them as independent people. So in the case of amnesty and human rights issues there, I think amnesty somehow was persuaded and perhaps co-opted and bought to the extent that they can't stop these wars, but they might try and influence those wars. They'll try and soften them a little bit. They'll try and give a human rights face to the real politic of the world. That's my best guess on amnesty.
I don't...
No, it wasn't.
I don't think either of you have answered the question. To go back to the Roman Empire, I agree. The question still is there. Why did the Roman Empire try to conquer the whole world? Why? Is it inbuilt in human nature to try to take over? Are we genetically wired to take over other people? Is that the reason?
That's a separate
And the second question on Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, I actually agree with you because I've seen it in another context. But could you give me 2 more minutes on why?
I don't think so, because I think it's a big question. It's a good question, but I don't think we're going to resolve it here.
Okay, this is for Drew. It looked as though you had some more maps there.
Just another one.
I'd be interested to see, was one the world according to Al Jazeera?
Oh.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
That's a map of how things apparently are according to Al Jazeera. But here, I'd like to draw it back to the question, if you want, of the proxy war of American imperialism. Oh, okay. You might ask why Syria is, effectively at war. Why is this? This is your question. Then you might ask the question of why the United States requires, if you want, other forces to be armed and trained, including, if you want, terrorist formations. To do what? Just to destroy the Syrian state. Why? What's the crucial question about Syria? Is it pipelines? Is it? Or is it a matter of the need for the United States, in a sense, to move beyond the pipelines? If through this proxy war the United States is able to destroy, if you want, the Syrian state, what will this mean? What will this mean for Washington? It is about power. It is, in a sense, to ensure that the United States is able to exercise, if you want, hegemony throughout this region. And if one looks at an earlier map, this is how, in a sense, the United States wants to redraw the Middle East. Again, one has to ask why. Wouldn't it be better for the United States to carry out regime change? That's effectively what they've done in Libya and various other countries, including the former Yugoslavia. To do what? Is it simply about greed? No, it's about, if you want, the need for the United States to dominate the world. Now, if one looks at Iraq, I should say Iran, yes, it's crucial. Because once, if you want, the Syrian state is destroyed, once Hezbollah is in a sense ruined, Iran is isolated. Always the United States, in a sense, if you need to look at history, has, from the time of the end of the Second World War, required, if you want, domination of the Middle East. You'll recall too that the very, if you want, dynamic of the Cold War. I didn't really want to talk about history, but here we are. What did it seek to do? It maintained a Cold War against what was then the Soviet Union, and then, if you want, the People's Republic of China. Why? It required, at that stage, in a sense, a Cold War and essentially containment. If one looks at Iran at this stage, until the final days of the Shah, what had Iran been? It's been part of the American northern tier in the Middle East. What happened in Iran since, if you want, 1979, 1980? This state, the Iranian state, in a sense, is separate. It had an entire different, if you want, outlook. It was not part of the American imperial system anymore. I suggest that Iran has to be destroyed. It has to be remade. And when you think of this map, of the redrawing of the map of the Middle East, what do you have here? Balkanisation. You have Finlandisation. But the United States isn't particularly concerned about making the world anew. It is concerned about, particularly in this period, I'd suggest, with US imperialism in decline, in ensuring that Iraq is brought into the fold. It's a client regime. And I'd also suggest what lays further than Iraq, Russia, particularly the Eurasian landmass. So if we're talking about non-understanding of wars in the Middle East, driven effectively by the United States, and yes, I did overlook, if you want, the heroic defence, I would say, if you want, of the Syrian people. To these attacks, how can you not understand why US imperialism is on the drive for global domination? Anyway.
We'll just pass it across.
I didn't really want to talk about this, Tim.
Sorry, my question's for you, Drew, regarding
Yes.
this map.
Yep.
Given the relationship between Israel and
Yep.
America, how come Israel is seen as losing territory? Rather than, I would have just assumed
Yes.
they were gained.
I can't understand. I can't state why Israel may lose territory. I'm sure if you want the Israeli state, as you'd appreciate, was created through, if you want, its settler state endeavour. We don't know about the borders still, do we, of Israel? We know, in a sense, that Israel now sees much of the Lebanon, much of what exists as Syria and elsewhere as part of its, if you want, domain. However, what is the relationship between Israel, whoever, be it Netanyahu or Ben-Gurion, whoever, what's the relationship here between Israel, if you want, and Washington? It's always been subservient. It's always been, in a sense, it's always attempted, though, to exercise some, if you want, relative autonomy. But I really can't explain why Israel is losing territory. Maps are redrawn. Anyway, yes.
My question is to
Tim.
Tim. Tim.
Sorry, after your question, we'll go to the gentleman with the microphone, and then
Yeah, okay.
I'll continue on after that with passing the microphone.
Tim, the talk was fantastic. It was chock full of information that I want, we need. Is it in your book, the Dirty War in Syria? How can we get it?
Yeah, up to the beginning of last year it is, but there's a global research column which has most of my material. About half the book is free online there, and then articles from last year up into this year are on. If you look at my name, Global Research My Name, you'll find a list of articles.
In particular, about the so-called humanitarian agencies.
Yeah, there's articles there. There's something in the book about that, but there's some more updates because of Aleppo and the White Helmets and so on, then more of that comes into. But I suggest you read Vanessa Bealey, 21st Century Wire on the White Helmets. Who else?
Eva Bartlett.
Noah Osman.
Eva Bartlett.
Eva Bartlett.
Rick Sterling?
Well, Rick Sterling, yeah. Those people also.
So we'll move to this gentleman. Yeah.
My question actually comes from a comment I may have heard you make at the beginning of the introduction. Now, I think everyone in this room is familiar with PNAC, with the Process for a New American Century, and those horrible words of Paul Wolfowitz, I think it was, that said, progress will be slow towards global domination, absent a catalysing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Now, I thought I heard you link Al-Qaeda with the demolition of the World Trade Centers. Now, really, there is an abundance of evidence, an incontrovertible abundance of evidence linking American security agencies with the controlled demolition of the World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2, and also the destruction of Building 7, which was mounting a huge FBI investigation of tax evasion by Halliburton and Enron. There's also the fact that Silverstein, the owner of the buildings, put a $3 billion insurance on the World Trade Centers a month before they were demolished, specifically to cover terrorism. Further than that, we have toured, as part of the 9/11 Truth Movement, we have toured Professor Jones, who demonstrated large amounts of thermate, which is an American incendiary explosive produced exclusively by the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And that's actually how they got 2 110-storey buildings to fall at freefall speed. Did I incorrectly hear you assign any sort of blame to Osama bin Laden for this event?
What I was saying is that the media tends to that the media tends to blame Al-Qaeda, and the same media that blames Al-Qaeda for the falling of the 9/11 towers are now relying on Al-Qaeda for sources in Syria. So I wasn't blaming Al-Qaeda for the fall of the towers. It was just how, one time the media is demonising them for, bringing down the towers supposedly, but then relying on them in Syria for, sources.
I really don't think we can make sense out of anything that's going on without firstly understanding that is the modus operandi. If you tell a lie, make it a really big one and blind the people from there.
I would disagree with that actually, because I don't believe the official story about 9/11, but the problem is, I think in terms of big myths, you have to deal with them one at a time. So if you try and explode several myths in a row, then it's much more difficult when you come into rational debate, basically. I don't find the 9/11 story essential to tell a story about the new Middle East, because they announced the new Middle East. They told us what they're going to do. They're going to take over these countries, they want to reshape the region and so on. It's consistent with the history of imperialism, which is to control whole regions, to exclude competitors, in this case Russia and China. And so whatever you think about the 9/11 incident, it's not essential, and to my mind actually clouds a clear debate on the wars in the Middle East.
Okay, so for the next question,
my question's for Drew.
just push the button now.
Yeah, for Drew. You mentioned in your talk about the privatisation to Western corporations of the oil industry in Libya. It's interesting to hear what these wars are actually leading to, what the end result is, why we go to war. So I'd like to hear if you've got any more about, perhaps just briefly, if the oil industry, was it nationalised or was it, state-run before under Gaddafi, and then what were the companies involved and by what process did they?
It was state-run. It was state-run.
Yeah.
However, we need to be a little cautious when we talk about oil industries being state-run. They are too in Saudi Arabia. But they're in combination effectively with American oil corporations. If we talk about prizes, I mean, Libya was a prize, that was part, I use the word, of the Arab winter. But I also think it's just part of the American jigsaw in remaking the Middle East. Yes, it is about resources. And then, if I can swing wildly to Israel, why is Israel, in a sense, sacrosanct? Here I can speak as someone who doesn't obey the right to return. But if you get my drift, but the point here is Israel is effectively a garrison state. Where does it stand? It's always been effectively under the, if you want, tutelage, support of the United States. But geographically, where does it stand? Well,
What do you mean?
you need to consider, if you want, what are the major oil routes from, if you want, the Gulf states and from the Persian Gulf. That's crucial. The United States doesn't want to directly control the oil supply, but it does want, if you want, compliant regimes, perhaps even client regimes, that will not impede or change. If we look at what Saddam Hussein sought to do when seizing the forgotten province of, if you want, Kuwait, and that's what it was. I'm not endorsing Saddam Hussein. I'm swinging wildly here. But what I'm suggesting here, the United States wants dominant control in the region, irrespective of what regime that there might be. Along the way, if I can be brutal, there will be collateral damage. And that's exactly what's happening in Syria. Now, I think someone yesterday, Costigan spoke of pipelines. They're crucial. They're crucial to American ambitions. So when we look at the question of American imperialism and why it wants to redraw the map, perhaps the answer isn't so difficult. It wants to dominate. It wants to dominate these resources. And beyond that, the great East Asian, if you want, area which has, bounteous energy resources. But as far as Libya goes, when it came to oil, it was the purest of oil, probably the best oil that was shipped out of, if you want, the Middle East. And what did Gaddafi seek to do?
Start to trade oil in euros?
Yes,
Or gold diamonds?
precisely. And moreover, when we look at Saddam Hussein in Iraq, what was the problem here? Yes, all right. And is this another conspiracy? I'm not trying to defend the United States, but I am trying to suggest it does have motive, and it has ambition, and it does have strategy. And it may need, if you want, the mythology, perhaps of 9/11, or other pretexts to continue on this global drive. But of course, I'm just being an ideologist, aren't I?
We'll move on to...
My question's for Tim. It's in regards to the human rights groups. Sorry, I just want to know your thoughts on what actions can come up to be like impartial and fact-based knowledge. Pretty much, which is the best way for a person from one state to help another, to stop humans killing humans without that whole savior complex? And are there any such groups out there?
Well, I would say, like in terms of international relations generally, and how the thing is, I think I would encourage people to make friends, to visit people, and to understand them. If you want to help someone who you don't know, you should look again at yourself. Why are you doing this? Someone has herded you into doing that, or do you have this inherent desire to go and help people you don't know? Why not make friends with people, go and understand their culture, and it'll be very rewarding. Probably I find rewarding going and learning from other cultures. So I think that's the first step, more or less. There are a lot of young people. I see them in my classes. That really want to do this. They want to get in development into aid, particularly, and join the United Nations or Oxfam or something like that, and go and help poor people. When they go over there, they see sometimes things are a little bit different. This is a big industry. Global aid is over $100 billion industry. There are imperatives driving it. It's a permanent industry. It's an anti-democratic industry because people don't have a say in their services when it comes from a foreign aid program. So I think the first thing is to try and go to other cultures, learn from them, make friends there, and it may be that young people get more out of that than if they go with the idea that they, with little experience, have something to save or help poor people from. I think that we really have to develop our own understandings and of other cultures, and to learn how to learn from other cultures too. I think which requires respect and friendship. To me, that's sort of at the root of it, really. Maybe it sounds simplistic, but to develop friendships across cultures, I think, is more profound than it might sound at first. You meant it in a general sense, didn't you? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Flavia. I've just got two questions. The first one, the 2013 Ghouta chemical attacks, and the recent ones, April of this year. In both instances, white helmets were ferrying victims of the chemical attacks, but not wearing gloves, not wearing masks. Just wondering, anybody here with a medical background if it's a sarin gas attack, wouldn't you be?
Yes, the white helmets weren't there in East Ghouta, but there were jihadists pretending to be first aid people, that's true. And there are, one thing you notice about both of them, there's all of these children out of context. Where do all these children come from? Where are the mothers with, you've got 10 children, no mothers, no parent there, basically. But you've got a lot of, let's say, fighting age men with beards and no moustaches and so on. Basically, all the signifiers of Salafi militants. So there are a lot of common features in those two elements there. I think, the point you make is correct about the Kanche Kun was that there was no protective gear, but not more than that. People said they smelt this gas from a long way away. Sarin doesn't smell. Chlorine does, of course, or chlorine compounds, crude mixtures of certain things. We know they've had sarin. The Al-Qaeda groups have had sarin off and on, at least since 2012. But we know they've also had other crude chemicals, and they were discovered in East Aleppo, and they've been filmed, and there's no secret about it. They were arrested in Turkey with 2 kilos of sarin back in early 2013, and so on. There's a lot of evidence there. So they've got all of these sorts of things, but on the Kanche Kun, of course, the best independent source now is that MIT scientist Ted Postol, the professor who's the scientific and forensic consultant to the Pentagon, if you want to read about that. But and he also analysed these Ghouta with some help from Mimi, who has a background in chemistry and quantum physics, really. Yeah, so the pattern is very... Sorry?
Stand up and take a bow.
No, don't. Yeah, so, sorry Flavie, did that answer your question? I wrote a chapter on East Ghouta in my book. There's a chapter, I think it's chapter 9, and it's also on global research about all of the available evidence on East Ghouta, the detail of it. There was North American evidence, there was Syrian evidence, there was journalists from Jordan, there was a range of evidence there. So I tried to detail that one. When the 20th one comes along, I think, why do we have to keep doing this? Because is there no historical memory in these people? When this is the sad thing about it, when they fail in some sense, but they succeed. I mean, the problem with Kanche Kun for me is that the media has no sense of history. They keep repeating the allegations so long as it suits their story. And the message it sends to the Al-Qaeda groups is, you can go and murder children, you can do whatever you like, because we will respond with a missile strike, we will help you, we will encourage you, we will reward you. It's like a dog. The dog does something awful, and you reward them. Well, they're going to do it again. That's the sad thing for me.
Can I just add that it's always interesting that they don't include in the mainstream media just even basic medical facts. Because, going on about constricted eyes and all of this, when the antidotes are atropine, which they have dilated pupils. And they seem very keen to give us lots of medical information about, diets and this, that, and the next thing. But when it's real, the reporters seem to be suddenly medically incompetent.
Yeah, it's a more general thing. I think one thing you remind me of is that ever since the war began in early 2011, there is no article about Syria from the BBC or the ABC or the UK Guardian or any of those other, or the New York Times, that does not have to predicate itself with a brutal dictator who's killing his own people. This is like part of Bashar al-Assad's title now, brutal dictator. Hi, I'm brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad. Nothing can be said until you do that sort of Hail Mary in the scenario, more or less. But if you look at the BBC, a few months before, they had a 5-part series on Syrian schools. A beautiful documentary, actually. British journalists were able to go in. They talked about the political context of the schools. They did a wonderful documentary. It was done in 2010. It came out in early 2011. Nothing like that since. They cannot talk about Syrians as human beings because of the war. And this flows on, it affects everything, But somehow in 2010, they were able to do it, And so you imagine the journalists in that situation, that they are not necessarily fools, but they are living in this straitjacket because of the war.
So we've got one follow-up question. straighten and I'm going to come to that side of the lecture hall. So I'll go to Dr. Nicholas Aljalou and then the two gentlemen here.
Sorry, I know I arrived very late for Dr. Cottle's talk, but just a question. If US imperialism and redrawing the Middle East, if Europe is the client partner for both alternate pipelines through Iraq, Syria, then what role is Europe playing at the moment in this American imperialistic sort of this part of the strategy, according to your knowledge?
Well, we have to consider here, is it Europe, or is it NATO, and which countries in Europe have followed, if you want, the United States into this war? I think that's crucial. I think the other point too about, if you want, Europe and the European Union is that obviously it's in crisis. But in a sense, when we look at which European countries are involved and why, which ones are they? France? Germany certainly the United Kingdom. And it's always had a very strong relationship with the United States. France, it's concerned, I would say, about Syria because of its past. No? I don't know if these wars are of neo-colonialism, but the crucial thing is the United States is able to ensure that it does have certain willing allies that will take part to a greater or a lesser extent in what the proxy war, if we're talking about Syria, with the expectation that there will be rewards. What no European country has ever done is to stand opposed, if you want, to the proxy war or the intervention, the humanitarian intervention into Syria, let alone Libya. If we reel backwards, again, I suppose I shouldn't talk so much about imperialist history. But when did all this begin? It began essentially when the Cold Peace began. And that was after the implosion of the Soviet Union. Now, think of this. What's happened since then? Yes, Russia has been created. But if we think of NATO, what was NATO expected to be? It was expected to be, if you want, or offer a nuclear umbrella for Western European capitalism. Well, where is NATO now? Everywhere. Afghanistan, Iraq, just about everywhere. And NATO carried out, if you want, the assault, aerial assault. And of course you'll appreciate the American fleet was just off the Libyan coast, just in case. The point about this is when we're talking about European countries or the European Union, in a sense they're complicit, or they're certain of the states are active agents in this proxy war, in this continuing war. I haven't seen any of them turn towards Russia or China, or perhaps economically. But here it gets back to the question I really didn't want to talk about, was US imperialism. What is the problem with US imperialism? Economically, it's in significant decline. Economically and globally, it needs, in a sense, to carry out these wars to ensure that that its effective global hegemony will be maintained. And here, US imperialism would be looking for, in the redrawing of this map of the Middle East, European allies. And some have come, most haven't. It's whatever their propensity is. So I hope that somehow addressed your question. Perhaps it didn't. Thank you.
Alright, so I'll pass it on to Dr. Nicholas Al-Jalou, who gave a very excellent presentation last night.
Thank you, Paul. My comments and then a question are for Tim. First, I was really interested in the fact that you brought up Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and you know, I've often found Human Rights Watch to be a little bit better in terms of objectivity and in terms of reporting on human rights abuses, just a little bit better. But when it comes to Amnesty International, I mean, as someone that was born and raised in Australia, you know, conditioned by the media, conditioned by the system, you see that, you know, Amnesty International is the group talking, you know, for human rights, speaking for human rights, writing letters to people to have people released from prison, etc. So this is the environment or the milieu that I was raised in. And look, when I take off my hat as a scholar and as an academic, and I put on my hat as an activist for my own community, being of a Syrian background, I've tried to engage Amnesty International in the past. You know, when Assyrians have been forced out of their villages because of ISIS attacks, or when Assyrians were being victimized by the Kurdistan regional government, etc., etc. They are not interested. I have found that Amnesty International is more of a renter crowd that follows the group with the most money and the most numbers. So I agree with you completely on that. The second comment is specifically about the story regarding the President Sayed Naya, and that's something that affected me a lot because I've been to Sayed Naya a couple of times. And when I saw that story on the news, I could not believe it, okay? I have cousins that lived in, I have friends that lived in Sayed Naya. I couldn't believe it. Why? And according to your presentation, all the stories regarding this quote-unquote prison where political prisoners were being executed were unverified or even unverifiable. And the second comment I'd like to make is, when human rights organizations that have this air of legitimacy or credibility pass around stories like this to the media as if they are undeniable facts, that should be a crime, and that should be something that is prosecuted in a court of law, okay? Because if you can't verify something and pass it on as fact, you are actually you are actually committing a criminal act. Fake news, as President Trump would like to say. So my question is, knowing that Sayed Naya was a 90% or majority Christian town, and knowing that the Syrian opposition is mostly backed by Sunni extremist groups or Sunni chauvinist groups that have in the past marginalized Christians and are very much opposed to them because they support the government. Is that story fabricated in order to further criminalize Syria's Christian community? That's my question.
Well, thank you for the question, Nick. Remember, that story also had as another unverified aspect was that Sheikh Hassun, the Mufti of Syria, very loved man, very spiritual man, was accused, without substance, of ratifying and signing off on every single execution in that prison. You know, here's a, what do you call it, show trial, you know, like, none of the groups that say these things have ever been to Syria. Amnesty interviewed a few dozen people in Turkey who are basically Al-Qaeda operatives. Maybe some of them were in jail. there've been prisoner exchanges. Syria has released a lot of, and sent them to Idlib, and some of them have gone back to Turkey and they've gone to Europe, and of course we can't really deny the fact that this has become a whole industry of the export of terrorism into Turkey, affecting the ordinary people in Turkey with the bombings that have gone on in Turkey and into parts of Europe, like Germany, for example, and other parts. So of course they're based in, around their capital in Gaziantep in South Turkey there, and all of the fact-finding missions and human rights groups and so on come down to meet them, and then maybe they go across the border into Idlib and are treated as heroes because they've entered free Syria or something, where the citizens of those areas, as you saw, the people coming out of East Aleppo and Vanessa's video, mainly Vanessa's videos in that thing before, it's a very different story. Where was the Western colonial media when those people came out of Aleppo that had run this campaign, Save Aleppo? They were nowhere to be seen. Give the microphone to an expert.
I just want to comment on one thing. I want to thank you for the question and thank you for the comment on there. But I wanted to say that the mainstream media is not going into Syria, despite the fact that the Syrian government has multiple times told them that anyone who needs a visa, we are happy to give you a visa to enter. We are even happy to give you a translator to go with you, to take you to the areas that you need to take. And it's not even a secret that there are certain agencies in Syria that now operate like tourist agencies, that you just apply online. They tell you, we get you the visa, we take you. It's just like you're going for tourism, but in a war zone. So if that's applicable to civilians, I'm sure that's very easy for the mainstream media. I just want to say one thing concerning the Idlib cross border to Turkey and Gaziantep. First of all, Gaziantep is now overflowing with NGOs, and I'm very sad to say that most of them are Lebanese NGOs, because it's very easy to buy some Lebanese NGOs. So they are located in Gaziantep, and they are even blatantly posting on social media that they require experts, and especially social media and communication experts, to work, and they have very salaries are very high salaries as well, and it's all documented as well. You can easily get them. And at the same time, at the time when it's always underreported, but she was a dear friend, and she was a reporter for Press TV, Serena Shem. You should all Google search her and look at her Twitter accounts and her mother's Twitter account. Serena Shem was a reporter for Press TV in Istanbul, and she went to cover the Kobani, the Ain al-Arab Kobani battle, where ISIS was fighting and the Kurds were fighting against ISIS. So she went in the Turkish area, from the Turkish territories, to cover it, and Serena was killed. 24 hours before she was killed, she was on live report with Press TV on Skype, and she told them, I fear for my life because I have been followed and people have come to the hotel and asked about me, and the villagers are telling me to leave. The second day at 4 a.m. she took a car with her friend. They were leaving. They were some sort of an accident. They were taken to the hospital. One of them died, which is Serena, and the other had a serious concussion. And Serena had video. The video is, I have friends in Press TV. When I went to Tehran and spoke with them, they have video. They are not allowed to report about it. Serena had video of WHO trucks going into Kobani, but they had militants and weapons inside of it. That's why she was killed. So basically, if you want to report about how Al-Qaeda is functioning, you will die right there. And Serena was a mother of two. And she was an American Lebanese. None mainstream media, no court, no judge, no lawyer in America took a responsibility or held maybe some morals, humanitarian morals, to go and ask what happened, maybe sue who was behind it. But she was killed because she was reporting about it, and yet the mainstream media would take any word coming from any terrorist affiliate on anyone on the ground. We all remember Caesar, we remember Danny, we remember everyone, how they were exposed. So I just wanted to let that out. Thank you.
I think the main threat there was that she was exposing a link between Turkish intelligence and ISIS at that time.
So we'll move on to this gentleman over here.
Okay, my question is to Tim, and particularly given the recent manipulation and selective use of international law, can you see any ongoing role for the United Nations in the ongoing war in Syria and indeed in any future settlements?
Well, the United Nations Security Council was created to prevent war. Obviously it's failed in doing that because of the series of wars we've had this century. Only with Syria did Russia and China start to move against their American partners to a degree. So in other words, the bipolar nature of the world has re-emerged, and of course you see that in the United Nations. It's notable that almost all the Latin American nations are allied with Syria. The BRICS nations recently called for, despite the fact that of the soft coup in Brazil, despite the cautiousness of the Chinese, the cautiousness of the Indians, the BRICS nation supports Syria, the sovereignty, and made a statement against the Trump intervention, basically. So that sort of division is re-emerging in the United Nations, but as you know, there's nothing of democracy in the Security Council. The Western nations, Britain, France and the US, still dominate that, but we've seen sort of like a new version of a Cold War emerge there. And I mean, this is fundamental to the discussion about imperialism, isn't it? Because imperialism, yes, it wants privileged access to resources, but it also historically wants to exclude competitors. And obsession about competitors. So even though to my view, neither the Chinese, despite their export of capital, nor the Russians appear as imperial powers like the US, but that's the way the US sees it. They see them as competitors. They certainly see China and Russia as competitors, and they want to break their access to the Middle East. They would like to control the terms on which the other big powers, by the way, which includes Western Europe, because let's remember that Western Europe in many respects is a competitor with the US economically, and the US strategy to do with Russia, which influences the whole discussion of NATO and the EU, is the transatlantic narrative which the German government maintains, but the German people are very sceptical of now, is to try and break the economic nexus between Russia and Europe by having this wall of Eastern European nations, Poland, Ukraine and so on, between them basically. Now, how long that obsession goes, I don't know, but the thing is, if you remember, the priorities of imperialism in the past, of great empires, has been to get exclusive control of resources and markets, and in the past slaves and so on, but also to exclude the competitors there. And so in the big picture terms, a lot of the European nations, going back to the EU question, their attitude to Syria is more or less wedded to their whole strategic approach to, what's the EU's and NATO's relationship with Russia, for example. It's really deeply embedded now. So some of the skeptics in Europe, in particular the Italian government, for example, has this bridge mentality now that they're going to, even though there's a common European policy on Syria and so on, and in respect to Russia, but there are some departures and dissent with it, and I've just mentioned that Italy's view at the moment is quite different to France and UK.
My name's Fahad. First of all, I just had a very quick comment in reply to your question. And the problem with sarin is that in dermal contact, some of the effects can be delayed. And I think the bigger problem is not that why weren't they wearing respirators and gloves and so on, but we can't actually tell what agent was used unless we investigate. And I think the more concerning thing that we should be kind of all asking ourselves is why did Doctors Without Borders say, oh, there's evidence of a nerve agent and chlorine gas, but there's only evidence of one munition actually being used. So these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. But we can't actually know what was actually used without someone going in to investigate, which the West seems very uneager to do. My question was actually for Tim, and it's in regards to, I remember reading the Amnesty report on the Sedona prison, and I remember going through it and looking at some of the methodology and how they derived the figure that they got, which was a bit childish and purposely misleading, I thought. But my question is about the use of things like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. When it comes to other areas, for example, Palestine, Israel, a lot of the work they do is actually quite good, I would say. So I guess my question to you is, how do human rights campaigners and people in this room, for example, activists of our sort, how do we manage to navigate, for example, using an Amnesty source to say, oh, well, look at Israel, firing white phosphorus on Gazan children, and then come out and say Amnesty has a disgusting and misleading line on Syria?
Just in relation to the Doctors Without Borders, Vanessa Beeley and I spoke to one of their bosses in Greece last year, and they admit they've got no one in Syria, no one on the ground at all, but they had an $18 million budget the year before, 2015, for Syria. So what's going on there? They've got no one there, they spend a lot of money in Syria, because they fund clinics, but they only fund them in the Al-Qaeda held areas, only in the Al-Qaeda held areas. So their source of information also coming from the Al-Qaeda held areas. So they are in a similar boat to Amnesty. In relation to Amnesty, you should know, in relation to Palestine, that the US also criticises the settlements on the West Bank. The US government has consistently criticised the settlements, but done nothing effectively about it, hasn't stopped them giving arms and so on. So there's a certain degree of legitimacy that's required of an agency that pretends to represent human rights when there's gross abuses going on, as in the bombing of Gaza, for example. Nevertheless, the way they're presented is very biased. You would know that there's a common sort of view, which I would call a left Zionist sort of view, which really, to get a degree of legitimacy, is required to recognise, as the human rights reports on Syria recognise, that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are committing violations, but their primary focus is the Syrian government. In relation to Palestine, they will use a moral equivalence. You may have noticed that, the Palestinian rockets are war crimes and the Israeli repression is war crimes too. A moral equivalence, which I, in a version of the paper I'm going to write on this, I'm going to point out, you can actually document the level of civilian damage, civilian deaths by Palestinian attacks and the Israelis, and there's no comparison. There's not a moral equivalence at all. But nevertheless, people can acquit themselves as being apparently independent by having a bit of a both sides argument going in there. I think you'll find that the Amnesty material is very biased in that way. While they recognise Israeli war crimes, George Soros, for example, is seen by a lot of right-wing Israelis as being anti-Israel. I say that's quite false. I think that there is a left Zionist line out there which is about wanting a nicer, friendlier Israel, basically, and to legitimise a racist state, but with some concessions, supposedly to do with the settlements and other things like that. But they're just as bad on the resistance, on the people at arm. They want a passive Palestinian resistance. They will constantly attack, as much as the right-wing Zionists, Hezbollah and Syria and Iran, because they are the only ones funding and supplying arms to the Palestinian resistance. So there's a certain attempt to reshape a hugely legitimate, specific, exceptional type of nationalism, which is Palestinian nationalism, to recognise that and incorporate it in a subordinated sense. A bit like native title is sort of a way to recognise and subordinate the claims of Indigenous people in this country. Whether you want to engage with them, yourself is a strategic question you have to consider. But I think we can't say that they're independent in the Palestine issue.
We move to the gentleman at the front.
Hi, my name's Davey McDonald, and I also, like the person up the end there, apologise for coming in here late. So anything I say, I hope hasn't been covered. I just wanted to respond to the gentleman there, the doctor, regarding comments made about Human Rights Watch. I think anybody who is on Twitter can follow Kenneth Roth there and see that he uses Gaza images to expose so-called war crimes in Aleppo. So that deals with Human Rights Watch. The next thing I'd like to come to, by the way, this isn't my question, but I'm just responding there, to Amnesty International. On YouTube you can find a video which is called The Humanitarian War in Libya. I believe that's the right name. And on that, Pauline Garrigos admits that she lied and that Amnesty International lied about the attacks of Gaddafi on his own people.
Yeah, that was covered by Tim.
Oh, sorry. Well, okay. In regards to Médecins Sans Frontières, which just briefly came up, they do have a spokesperson in Turkey who has actually allied himself with all the nonsense that you've received out of there. Again, I don't know whether that was covered. And the next comment I make about fake news, as that came up, and I want to bring this into the diaspora of what I wanted to raise and ask a question, and that is there's another organisation out there called Bellingcat. And Bellingcat published widely on Gotha, but also on another issue, which is Ukraine. And that's what I want to bring some focus and ask a question on. And that is, I want to just take you back in history just a little bit here. I'm glad I'm not standing up here because I can read from my notes I made here. In respect, if you can imagine, I have a schematic, and I'm going to lead you through this, starting with Syria. In 1970, at the end of the annihilation of Black September, the UK and the USA were threatening to invade Syria. The Russians had dispatched a fleet there and said, if you go in, we go in. As a result of that, they were able to obtain the base of Tartus. Tartus is extremely important because it gives the Russians access to the Mediterranean, the ability today to supply Syria with its equipment and support. In 2012, this is before Ukraine, in 2012, Putin threatened, because the Americans again were waving the banner at Syria, threatened to send in Marines. And I've actually written about this, and I can direct you to an article that I wrote about all of that. So the key thing about Tartus is the access to resupply Syria through the Bosphorus and Turkey, and there are issues there that we know about, and I won't get diverted there. And that brings us back to the Black Sea. And the Crimea was critical to this. The US had their eyes on Crimea, and therefore they wanted the Russians out of there. So they orchestrate the coup d'etat against Yanukovych in 2014, and was looking for their willing ally. And this comes back into something I picked up on the end of your presentation, was this, I claim, I would suggest, is part of the American jigsaw, and that have anybody considered that that is in fact the case, and that's a US motive of what they've been doing in Ukraine. So both are indelibly linked. And I've got an answer for a question the gentleman there asked regarding tomahawks and what was going on there. I actually posted that today, and I'll share that with you afterwards. But I think the sarin gas attack response by the US was a response to test their missile system against a system that the Russians have deployed in 3 places, two in Russia and 1 in Syria, was to test the jamming capabilities of the Russians to divert Tomahawk missiles and all sorts of other stuff as well, other kit the Americans had got. So I guess my question is have you considered that? Do you believe that there may be some reality in what I've just said there? And I also want to put into context what I've brought with you today, but just quickly tell you where I come from, the journey that brought me here. And that is that from 1997 to 81, I was responsible for all the security for the Anti-Nazi League in London, in the UK, and beyond that. And also in 1994, when it was being opened, the Holocaust Museum, I did a presentation, I'm an anti-Nazi, a presentation on German war crimes in Poland. And Zionists have a difficulty dealing with people like me. So I wanted to say that to you. So thank you for your indulgence.
Well, I can...
Sorry.
I've come in late. All I can say is that many of your arguments, have, if you want, more than a possibility of actuality and accuracy. What hasn't been done is to look at this broader jigsaw. Now, what the jamming capabilities of the US are, I've no idea. However, I think when one looks at the proxy war in Syria, it can't be separated from what has happened in the Ukraine. Nor can it be separated from, if you will, the UN, NATO's establishment in the Baltic, in Poland, and elsewhere. Why is this occurring? Is there going to be a showdown? Who knows? Similarly, I don't want to swing wildly, but why was there an American pivot to Asia, China? Again, it's a question of geostrategic advantage. So, as far as verification of your arguments, we need to see, if you want, I think the American proxy war in Syria in a much broader frame. And I don't know what will happen to Syria. Yes, I've been chided by Tim. I've overlooked, the heroic resistance. Nevertheless, my talk essentially was about US imperialism and its drive, its geostrategic drive for global domination. That was my talk. And Syria was part of it. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions.
Okay. And we'll move on to Gabriel.
I would like to direct to Tim, and regarding yesterday about the new map of Turkey. You mentioned about the bombardments in Turkey happening, and the reason for that, it is 90% of the bombardments, explosion happening in Turkey is all staged out, like a false flag, all organized, staged by Sultan Erdogan. A few years ago, when the uprising in Turkey started, the ministers around Erdogan, they had a secret meeting, and they said, in order to annex northern Syria, we will send rockets into Syria, give to our men to fire into Turkey, to have an excuse to go invade over there and take over Syria. And all this bombardment happening is part of all that agenda. So the Kurds, they are bombarding as well, but majority of the bombardment is done by ISIS. Turkey is giving the weapon to them to do that.
Certainly there was a famous false flag in northern Syria that was exposed by some wiretaps or recordings of conversations, but there's another factor there. And the other factor is this: even if you're a strong state and you arm groups of this size with thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of armed fighters, they're not completely in your hand, not completely. And if they feel betrayed, if they're dying and their friends are dying and they feel betrayed, they're going to look for the people that betrayed them. And that's why Saudi Arabia and there was an attempted coup in the UAE. Saudi Arabia bans all of the Al-Qaeda groups. They love Al-Qaeda groups in other countries. The US and Israel love Al-Qaeda groups as long as they're pointed at Hezbollah and pointed at Syria and pointed at their enemies. So in Turkey, the betrayal of those groups, which means to say they lose Aleppo, who are they going to blame? They blame each other. They start killing each other in Idlib. If the Turkish government withdraws support, does some deal with Russia, and they have been talking with Russia, and Russia has enough influence to counter leverage to get them talking to them, then the same Russia that's bombing those groups in Syria is going to start to feel betrayed by the Turkish government. And if the Turkish government withdraws and allows them to be defeated and routed out of Idlib, for example, there's going to be a Save Idlib campaign this year, we know that, because one thing about despite the tragedies of the evacuation of the civilians from Thawr and Kafraya, one of the good things it's doing is clearing out large amounts of civilians in those Al-Qaeda areas, opening the scene for a stronger battle in that province. And so if Turkey effectively doesn't supply them sufficiently, betrayal in the mind of a sectarian crazy people is something that we don't quite see. But that sense of betrayal, I believe, is going to contribute to a backlash a blowback in Turkey. And ordinary Turkish people and Kurdish people and others are going to be affected by that. And I believe that's to some extent what's happening in Europe too, that it's a message about they're not getting sufficient support. Where is our Air Force, for example, So I don't think we can discount that factor, that the after effect of the Syrian military victory, which is ongoing in Syria, is going to be that Turkish people, ordinary Turkish people, are going to be hurt, and European people are going to be hurt. Less so people in the US, less so here. But in Europe, yes. In Turkey, yes. And this is what the Syrian president has been saying for some time. You can't just let this monster loose and think it's going to be totally contained. It's going to affect other people.
So we move on to this gentleman.
Hello. My question sort of builds on what you were just talking about. So, and what Paul's discussion yesterday, I just have a little disagreement about the expansionist tendencies of Turkey. I think this is more of an AK Party phenomenon. I don't think it's something that dates back throughout the Republic of Turkey. I just want to know why Western Europe tolerates Turkey and the current government. In fact, they support them. This is a party where its leader, Erdogan, has said that, has threatened to send a 3 million standing army of refugees to flood Europe, and the Western Europe has done nothing. In fact, they've provided billions of dollars to the Turkish government, but this is a government that's using human misery as a weapon, and they're using Syrian refugees as weapons. Why does Western Europe continue to tolerate this? And also, even if we accept that the Syrian army has bombed Syrian civilians, if we accept that, isn't it still not the fact that the Turkish government's actions are more of a threat to Western Europe, and yet they continue to I guess, support the wrong side of this equation?
Well, this comes to the crisis in Europe, the EU and NATO, which are increasingly linked. That a lot of European governments or peoples are very unhappy with the conduct of NATO, basically, and there are contradictions between Turkey and the US, not least over the use of the Kurdish card. I get interviewed by a Turkish journalist quite a lot, and she's always asking me exclusively, obsessively about the Syrian Kurds, and what does this new incident mean for the Syrian Kurds? So that contradiction of the US trying to use the Kurds to weaken Syria, and the Turkish government, the last thing they want is some sort of empowered Turkish enclave on their border, is one of the contradictions within NATO. You're right, of course, about the humanitarian weapon, or the weaponising of refugees. I mean, it was precisely the Turkish release of that big flood of refugees in 2015 that caused alarm in Europe and led them to paying Turkey billions of dollars to try and solve the so-called refugee crisis, but it was artificially turned on and turned off in many respects. A lot of the Europeans were not happy with that. The German people have not been happy with the aggression against Russia, because a lot of Germans left, right and centre say, why shouldn't we have a good relationship with Russia? But the German elite is very embedded with this transatlantic idea that wants to play this Cold War game of having Ukraine and Poland and other eastern countries as a buffer to obstruct this cooperation between Russia and Europe. Not everyone in Europe is happy with it. There are forces in Italy and France and Germany that are not happy with it. So Turkey has this anomalous role, but it's a big nation. Remember, it's 80 million people. It's not just Erdogan. So Turkey is a big nation, an important nation there. It has this strategic relationship with Europe and with Russia, and a role in the Middle East. So the Europeans are not happy with it, really. But it still has its own, different to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a family, It's not even a nation, really. But Turkey is a nation, and a big nation, important nation. And there are very important contradictions you pointed out between Western Europe and Turkey and Turkey and the US. And the funny thing is that the US, so long as it maintains its ambition to weaken or destroy Syria and doesn't retreat, as it did retreat from Iran. Before the war in Syria, there was, not that long ago, where there was going to be World War III over Iran and the attempts to disarm, to prevent nuclear weapons being developed in Iran. They retreated from that. It was too hard because they were bogged down in Syria. They couldn't knock over Syria the way they knocked over Libya. So ironically, if the US retreats from its campaign over Syria, and that's still uncertain, then in a sense, the threat that Erdogan feels from the Kurdish card is going to disappear too. So there are some forces at play there which might drive a wedge between Turkey and the US in terms of their final ambit of trying to partition. I don't think it's by any means certain, because I believe the logic of resistance is just as important to follow as the logic of imperialism. And we've heard a lot about the attempt to balkanize Syria. I think that's very important. We're aware of that. But there's a lot of people in Syria that have resisted, you know, with their blood and their family's blood, that plan, and that they have a strong alliance, a stronger alliance now than there was 6 years ago there. So, but Turkey is going to remain as a neighbour to Syria in the future. And so whatever people feel about the Turkish government at the moment, there has to be eventually some type of political agreement between Turkey and Syria. They're not talking at the moment. Iran is talking. So Iran and Press TV have a different attitude to the Syrian issue, because Iran doesn't want to inflame that at the moment. Iran has a different view. Iran also has a resolute view against the role of the US in the region. There's no role for the US in the region. Russia is playing another game. Russia says, oh, our American partners, our Western partners and so on, because they're still playing another game with Europe and so on. So, you know, we have to read that media bearing in mind that even though Iran and Russia and Hezbollah and Syria are partners, there are some significant differences there. And at the moment, Syria and Turkey are not talking, but, you know, with an 800-kilometre border, eventually there has to be some sort of talking between those countries.
Okay, just to conclude this session, I'm going to pass the microphone to Madame to make a statement or ask a question. We'll watch a short video that Tim's got loaded for us, and then I'm going to pass it to the young lady at the front who wants to make a final statement.
I have a question and a statement. But first, about the chemical weapons stuff, I just wanted to remind everyone that the first chemical weapons attack wasn't in Ghouta, it was actually in Aleppo in 2013 in March. And this wasn't widely publicized, but because the attack was against a Syrian government-held area and soldiers were affected. And this is actually the reason why the OPCW was in Syria at the time of the Damascus attack, because the Syrian government had requested their presence about the attack that happened a few months prior, and they arrived the same day as the Damascus attack. Now, in this first attack, the CBS News hired an expert called Bretton Gordon, who noted that none of the people in the hospitals treating the attack victims were wearing protective clothing. If a chemical agent had been dispersed, anybody coming into contact with the victims would also be affected. Doctors treating them would be overcome. And he said that none of these symptoms looked like nerve agents. He also commented about the fact that there was a smell of chlorine. Now, everything that has been similar, every symptom of that attack has been similar to the attack since, and the UN has stated that they believe the rebels were behind that attack. So the interesting thing is that very same expert is now being brought out to say that the new attacks are Syrian, even though he's completely contradicting himself. So, you know, just to show your question. On my question, well, I'll just say that Boris Johnson has just come out and said that he wants to behead world leaders, which has made him a part of ISIS in a sense, because he called for the beheading of Assad. So yeah, he just called for the beheading of Assad, which, you know, it's interesting that he would push his ISIS militants forward like that. But
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be, Britain is going to be a caliphate soon. So the question that I have though is about China and Russia. It's about North Korea. Trump, during his election campaign, said that you don't really want to push China and Russia into a corner together. You want to divide them. So you want to speak nicely to one while fighting the other, just like they did in the Cold War. But I'm a bit confused. I can't understand really what's happening. Before, under the Clinton and Obama administration, you had Russia and China being pushed into that corner, and you had China veto stuff on Syria. And Trump at the time was saying we should be friends with Russia, but he was making some harsh statements against China. As soon as he gets into power, he's trying to make nice with Russia, he's inviting Xi over, and he's like, my good friend Xi. China's didn't veto the strike, it was neutral on the strike on Syria. And then you have, but at the same time, US ships on the border of North Korea. And saying, we want to send a message to North Korea and China about our strength. So I don't, like, it's schizophrenic, like what's happening here? Are they just going insane, or am I not understanding? Oh yeah, and chocolate cake.
I think you shouldn't pay too much attention to the words, you know, because big powers are always threatening. It's what they do. You know, there's an old story I want to tell about the scorpion. You know, why did the scorpion sting me? That's just what I do, you know. But they keep threatening, and they always say every option is on the table. Yeah. They never in the past even rejected the possibility of first nuclear strike. The US had never rejected that, you know, so they threaten all the time. And the North Koreans threaten back, you know. They've had nuclear weapons pointed at them longer than I've been alive. So they're entitled to be paranoid. But they threaten everyone. There's also serious violent destabilisation going on in Venezuela as we speak. Economic sanctions, the political assassinations, they burnt down the Supreme Court buildings just recently. The US is using the Organisation of American States to try and overthrow Venezuela. It's been doing it for 15 years. So, you know, I am a little bit sceptical when people say, oh, World War III is going to happen, because yes, of course, that risk is always there, but what's new, the threats are there every day, and trying to point out inconsistency in Trump administration is a bit like, you know, well, I don't know, it's not really shooting fish in a barrel or something, you know, it's too easy. So I wouldn't take the words of the Trump administration too seriously. Their actions, yes. But if you look carefully at their actions in Syria, for example, it was carefully minimal in the version of the Obama regime, wasn't it? You know, they avoided the Russians. When they struck Shayrat Airport in Homs, they avoided Hmeimim base. They avoided the Russians. Yes, they probably were testing the missile defense system and the jamming and so on. Apparently, only 40% of the missiles got through. The Russians don't say that's the S-400. The S-400 doesn't have a 40% failure rate. But then, you know, there was a deconfliction agreement too. So, you know, Russia, as much as the US, does not want a direct confrontation. The deconfliction agreement was torn up, but they will put it back again because I believe that Putin, as much as Washington, does not want direct conflict. The same agreement they did with Israel, you know, it was a smart one. You can't fight 6 wars at once. Hitler couldn't fight 6 wars at once. You know, no, Napoleon couldn't fight 6 wars at once. So the Russians are protecting Syria. Fine. They want Israel. They don't want Turkey. They don't want everyone else involved in it at the same time. And that's smart in my view. It's not a betrayal, as some say. Basically, it's you deal with one thing at a time. And they don't want escalation, because escalation is unpredictable. You have no idea where it's going to go if there's greater escalation. Of course, in the meantime, the little people get hurt.
I think on that note, we'll watch the video that Tim's...
This is just a little video because it was touched on about the history of amnesty, and people asked about or mentioned some of these factors.
Our judgment that we've been attacked that day was wrong.
didn't happen.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails,
which could be activated within 45 minutes.
And if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north.
Mercenaries shooting people in the eastern city of Benghazi.
Il y aurait eu des mercenaires étrangers justement pour accélérer le processus de répression.
These mercenaries seem to have carte blanche to pillage and kill.
Aujourd'hui, force est de constater qu'on n'a pas de preuves concrètes d'utilisation de forces mercenaires par Kadhafi.
The rebels fighting the Assad regime say Syrian government troops fired rockets on these innocents, rockets carrying poisonous gas.
We know the Assad regime was responsible.
This is evidence. These are facts.
They went right away to the notion that it had to be Bashar, and the world's press went with them, including the American press, and in fact, they didn't have much of a case.
These rockets could have never been fired from government-controlled territory. They would be fired more from a rebel type of territory